Most of what Officer Mark Ellison saw in the woods in Michigan that night was never written down because the parts that mattered were scrubbed from every report, deleted from every file, and erased from every camera. But ask him now, years later, and he'll tell you, the thing they found wasn't a bear, wasn't a man, and wasn't at all confused about what it was doing. It was watching. It was waiting. And the worst part is, the government already knew it was there. Here's how it all went down, in Mark's own words. All right, I'm just going to lay this out. You can believe me or not, but this all happened on October 12th, 2017, in Manistee National Forest, Michigan. I was still with the state police back then, Post 66 Cadillac. I was night shift, but wasn't even supposed to be working that night. I had swapped shifts with Jeff so he could go hunting. I think about that a lot. If I'd just kept my schedule, none of this would have landed on me. Dispatch got a call around 10:42 p.m. A woman out near Wellston, panicked and rambling about her husband. She said he went into the woods behind their property to check out some screaming. That word stuck with me. Not howling, not yelling. Screaming, human sounding. Said it started around 10, and after 10 minutes of it, her husband grabbed his pistol and a flashlight and told her to lock the door. Johnson and I headed out there, thinking it was probably just a black bear or some other animal. Nothing too crazy. Nothing that didn't have a clear explanation. We get to the property, she comes out to meet us in the driveway barefoot, clearly out of her mind with worry. Kept saying, it looked wrong. It looked all wrong. We start heading into the woods. We're a bit nervous. It's dead quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get late at night. Just this blank silence. Even our footsteps didn't sound right. Surprisingly, we found the guy's flashlight maybe 40 yards in, still on, laying sideways in a small clearing. There were marks in the dirt, like drag marks. You could see where something heavy had been pulled. No sign of a struggle, just a straight line like something had been dragged along. Then we heard this sound. I don't even know how to describe it exactly. It was trying to sound like a growl, but it was off. Like a recording played backward, but too wet and too long. It felt fake in the worst way, like it came from something that had learned how to mimic sound but didn't know when to stop. We both stopped cold. Johnson whispered, "That ain't right," again and again. Then we saw it, just beyond the first few rows of trees, partially lit by the beam from Johnson's flashlight, standing behind a pine. It was big, 8 feet or more, with this hunched posture like it was used to being on all fours, but was trying to stand up. Arms hung lower than they should, like it didn't know what to do with them. Legs were bent in a way I can't explain. Not like animal legs, just nothing I can explain. Like it wasn't built for this world. It stepped forward once, just enough for us to see it better, then slipped back behind the tree like it was teasing us. I felt this buzzing in my chest. Not fear, not adrenaline, like standing too close to a power transformer. Every hair on my body was up. Then the trees started clicking. That's the only word I've got. Clicking. Like sticks being snapped, but fast and from all directions. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, coordinated. I don't know how else to say it. It felt like communication. I went for my radio. Nothing. Dead air. No static, no tone. Like it wasn't even turned on, though I checked twice. Johnson dropped to his knees and started dry heaving. Said he smelled metal and dirt, like a butcher shop buried underground. I didn't smell anything, but the look on his face told me he wasn't faking. Then we heard it move. Quick. Just a blur across the edge of the clearing. I turned and heard a snap behind me. There, hanging from a low branch, was a buck, strung up by its back legs like it had been field dressed, only it hadn't. No cuts, just hanging there. Johnson screamed and started running. I hesitated and looked back toward where we saw the thing, and now it was standing just outside the trees. No more hiding. Its face was shaped like a human skull, but stretched. The features were there but distorted. The eyes didn't blink right. They went sideways like some deep-sea fish. It tilted its head and I swear it grinned. wide and slow, like it knew something we didn't. Then it stepped forward again. The sound under its foot wasn't leaves. It was crunching. And I know that sound. That was bone. Small ones. Dozens of them. We ran. I grabbed Johnson by the jacket, and we bolted back to the house. I didn't look back until we got to the tree line. When I did, it was behind us, just watching, and it lifted its arm and waved, slow and deliberate, 2 fingers, like it was saying, "You made it this time." Backup showed maybe 15 minutes later. We went back in with 6 guys and 2 dogs. The dogs wouldn't go in. They just laid down and whimpered. We pushed forward without them, found the husband about 60 yards off the trail, tucked between some rocks. He was curled up in survival mode. We had to carry him out. His back had 3 long, thin gouges running from his shoulders to his waist. No blood trail, no sign of infection. Just these clean, precise lines like something had marked him. I don't know how else to say it. Next day, we're out there looking for evidence of something, anything to corroborate what we saw. And don't you know it, 4 black SUVs roll up, no plates. 4 guys in gray gear, no badges, no names. They took over the scene like they had a script. Told our captain it was a wildlife incident and that we weren't needed anymore. We tried to question it, but he shut us down. Said it came from higher up, way higher. They took our body cams, said they were faulty. Our incident report got reviewed, then came back with pages added that we didn't write. Whole parts of the timeline changed. The woman and her husband were relocated by the end of the week. No one said where. Johnson resigned within days. Said he couldn't stop dreaming about the sound it made. He moved to Arizona. Took a job at a gas station last I heard. Said he needed something real simple and mindless. I made it a few more months, but I started dreading every shift. Couldn't even drive past a stand of trees without sweating. Look, people joke about dogman stories up here. I used to also. But whatever we saw, it wasn't a story, even though it looked like something from folklore. Something that could hide in plain sight if it wanted to. And whoever those guys were in the SUVs, they didn't seem nervous or surprised. They didn't ask questions. They were cleaning up something, which means they knew. I'm telling this now because if I don't, it goes with me. And because that thing out there, it wasn't done. It let us leave on purpose, and that's not the same as being safe. I've been debating if I should even send this because it still feels so raw and weird. But after going back and forth, I decided, what the heck? I'm just a middle-aged guy from Munising, Michigan, who's been fishing the southern shore of Lake Superior since I was a teen. And in all my years out on the water, I've never witnessed anything close to what happened this past Tuesday morning, July 11th, 2023 to be exact. I'm still shaky thinking about it, but I'll do my best to lay it out for your YouTube channel because it might jog the memory of other folks who've seen something similar. I was out by Grand Island, the stretch of water just off the pictured rocks area, around 6 a.m. The skies were partly cloudy, and the lake was calm, just a slight ripple on the surface. I remember mulling over whether to head up toward Miners Castle or circle back toward Chapel Beach, since the salmon run's been surprisingly active. Actually, the fishing's been decent despite the weird cold snaps we've had. You know how Lake Superior weather can be. Beautiful and pastel 1 minute, cold and steel gray the next. But Tuesday was fairly mild, so I set up a couple of trolling lines for cohos and was basically drifting, keeping an eye on my fish finder. At some point, around 6:30 or so, I started daydreaming about this old story my dad used to tell me. He claimed to have seen a massive sturgeon near Autrain back in the 1980s that he believed was older than any of us, practically a prehistoric beast. The device beeped, snapping me back to the present, and I noticed a pretty good reading on the fish finder. It looked bigger than an average trout or salmon. My first thought was that I'd maybe stumbled across one of those giant lake sturgeons or a humongous muskie. My heart always races a bit when I see a big mark like that, because you never know if you're about to hook a real trophy. Next thing I knew, the line jerked hard. I stood up to check the rods, and I caught a glimpse of something just beneath the surface. It was an enormous black silhouette gliding in the water toward the back of my boat. I thought it was a large fish, until I noticed it seemed to have something resembling ears, like almost triangular tips that surfaced for a second. It was so bizarre that I stopped everything I was doing. I let the reel go slack just so I could focus on whatever this thing was. It didn't behave like a fish at all. It moved a bit slower, more purposeful, almost patrolling. As it passed my stern, I saw what I swear looked like broad shoulders under the water, not a fin or tail the way you'd see on a sturgeon or muskie. I know how all this sounds. If I hadn't been so close, I'd probably say it was just a log or maybe some weird wave phenomenon. But I've seen logs floating. I've seen otters. I've seen beavers. I've seen bears swim across smaller lakes, and none of them move like that. This was fluid, but big, and that shaped head or ears, whatever they were, just stuck out for a moment. Gave me the creeps. It reminded me of a huge dog silhouette if a dog learned to swim, and somehow grew to a size that's just not natural. I moved around the boat, trying to keep my eyes on it. The water was so strangely dark, though, and the morning light wasn't the best, which frustrated me. I wanted a better look. It just kept gliding parallel to me before it vanished into deeper water. Part of me was so startled I just stood there with my mouth open. I tried to convince myself it could be some deformed bear or a stray black wolf that took a plunge. But we're talking deep water at Lake Superior, a good half-mile offshore. I've known guys who swear up and down they've seen dogman-type creatures on land, in the Upper Peninsula, around the Seney Stretch, or near the Hiawatha National Forest. In fact, one old buddy from Marquette used to talk about hearing howls so unnatural they chilled his blood near some logging roads at night. But I never put much stock in that. I always chalked it up to local folklore or too many beers around the campfire. But this was different. It almost felt like it was curious about my boat. For a moment, I wondered if it could smell the fish or my bait. Let me tell you, I've heard rumors from older fishermen about large wolves that occasionally swim between islands. There are documented cases of wolves traveling across the Great Lakes ice in winter, but never anything about a dog-like creature that lurks under the water, as if it belongs there. The fact that it didn't surface enough for me to see a snout or eyes still bothers me. All I saw was that black shape and the suggestion of ears. The sheer size of it. It had to span several feet from what looked like shoulders to back. I practically froze until it disappeared. What's odd is that I stayed out there probably another hour or so, half wanting to see if it would come back, half terrified it actually would. Every time a wave lapped against the boat or something brushed my lines, I jumped. I sort of lost my desire to fish, to be honest. But I didn't want to seem like a total coward by racing back to shore. Meanwhile, I couldn't stop thinking about all those stories about dogman sightings in Michigan. Most folks talk about seeing them near the forest edges or crossing roads, not swimming around in Lake Superior. I know Lake Superior has some strange history, shipwrecks, unexplained disappearances, you name it. But I never thought I'd be adding something cryptid related to that list. After I reeled in my lines, I headed back toward the docks near Sandpoint. I kept glancing over my shoulder, as if it would appear behind me like something out of a horror movie. My family was waiting at the cabin, wondering why I was jumpier than usual. I didn't mention a single word about the creature at first, because the logical part of my mind was still trying to piece together a more rational explanation. Then later that night, after dinner, I caved and told my brother, who just gave me this skeptical look. He asked if I was sure it wasn't just a seal, but Lake Superior doesn't have seals. And even if it were some rogue seal from who knows where, that doesn't account for the ear shape or the bulky shoulders. All I can think about now is how maybe these dogman reports are a lot more varied than I realized. If they're around on land, who's to say they can't swim? Dogs can swim. Wolves can swim, right? It's just I've never seen anything so big. And the bizarre way it stayed submerged except for that split-second glimpse of what I'm calling ears is haunting me. I keep replaying every angle. The shape, the movement, the slow, purposeful glide. It wasn't frantic or spooked. It was methodical, like it was aware of me and just didn't care. I've tried to research if there are any old tales about something like a dog-headed entity in the Great Lakes specifically, but all I end up finding are the standard dogman sightings inland or up near the forest lines. Not much about them being aquatic, which has made me feel really isolated with this experience. Still, I wanted to put this out there because maybe there's someone else who's run into a similar situation. My instincts tell me I wasn't just seeing a shadow or a trick of the light. I know the difference. Maybe someday I'll go back out around Grand Island at that same time and see if it shows up again, though part of me hopes I never do. I'm telling you, I've been on these waters for decades, and that day was different, beyond anything I can easily wrap my head around. If you decide to share this on your YouTube channel, I hope it can help piece together a bigger puzzle about whatever's out there. ARRL Marine Forecast can tell you about wave height and wind gusts, but apparently, no one's forecasting cryptid canines in the Great Lakes. I know I sound half crazed, but that's exactly what I saw, even though it's so freaky to admit it. I've been sitting on this for a long time, and every time I try to write it down, I get lost in all the details. There was a period back in the late 90s, around 97 or 98, when I was stationed at Camp Pendleton as part of the 1st Marine Division. I'd already done my time with a couple of scout sniper platoons by then, bouncing around from assigned posts in Okinawa to a short stint in the Gulf. Anyway, I ended up attached to some administrative duty for a few months, processing some intel reports and scanning classified material. It was mind-numbing to say the least, and at the time I cursed it. But looking back, that's when I happened upon some documents I still can't believe I saw. They were in a dull manila folder that looked no different from the billions of others in the office. I remember the folder number started with something like MCB0102, and it had Pendleton stamped across the tab in big block letters. My job was to skim through each file, confirm the reference ID matched what was on my checklist, and then sign off on it. Basically a paper trail meaning, yeah, we got it. But about halfway through this folder, there was a set of 3 or 4 typed pages that had been flagged for some reason. I recognized some acronyms I was familiar with, your typical intelligence references, location grids, and then something about unidentified canine-like entities. That phrase jumped out at me, and I ended up reading the thing line by line. I'm not sure how many people know this outside of select guys in military intelligence, but apparently there were these recurring sightings of something they referred to as DM or Dogman in the documents. It wasn't the official moniker, just more like a shorthand used in internal dispatches. The sightings supposedly happened out in the remote training ranges along the northeastern boundary of Pendleton, the sort of areas we typically use for live fire or specialized movement drills. Most of the accounts described a large wolf-like creature walking on its hind legs, spotted at a distance by perimeter patrols or recon teams. I can't confirm how high level these sightings went, but the reports were definitely compiled and passed upward through some channels. Whether it was just brushed off or actively kept under wraps, I can't say with 10% certainty. But judging by the dryness of the language, it was very matter of fact. These sightings need to be documented and not discussed further type of tone. I suspect it never saw the light of day outside of certain circles. There was a short chain of references that alluded to an incident in 1995 around Range 49, which is up in the northwestern corner of Pendleton. Some Marine recon guys were doing a late-night exercise, moving silently through rough terrain. They started picking up movement in their night vision scopes of what they thought were coyotes at first, maybe 2 or 3. Then they realized the silhouette was wrong. The gait was wrong. Everything about it was off. The document suggested these guys tried to confirm it was wildlife, but could never get close enough. One line said, I remember specifically, observers noted bipedal locomotion on 2 or more creatures. That made me do a double take. You don't see that described in official Marine intel too often. Another typed paragraph mentioned unusual tracks found near a weapons cache site a couple weeks later, around that same area. The tracks were described as elongated canine prints, but the stride length was bigger than anything the local wildlife typically had. Something like a 3 or 4 foot stride, if I recall, which is insane for an animal on all fours. let alone 2 legs. The only reason I believe these reports had any merit is that it came from recon guys I actually knew, at least in passing. One of them was a quiet professional who once gave me tips on better concealment for desert ops. He was not the type to make up weird stories, even off the record. I don't know how widely circulated these documents were, but they looked legit. They had classification stamps, routing names, that standard Department of the Navy letterhead, the typical disclaimers about unauthorized dissemination. I remember feeling torn. Part of me wanted to tell some of my buddies, but I also knew that was a quick way to get hammered by the brass. So I kept my mouth shut and finished my assignment, and it all just got filed away. For a while, I thought maybe I'd imagined half of it, or that it was some bizarre training scenario or code for something else. But no, reading that text was as real as anything else I processed that day. Things got weirder once I left that admin duty and rotated back to more fieldwork. I started hearing secondhand stories, not in official briefs, mind you, but over drinks at an oceanside bar or from a guy in the next bunk. People talked about strange howling in certain intervals at night near Basilone Road, especially in those more desolate spots. There's a big difference between how Marines talk about normal coyote chatter and how they talk about these howls. It had a different pitch, a different cadence. One guy made a passing remark about that upright wolf crap, then clammed up. It always seemed like folks wanted to say more but worried about sounding nuts, or worse, letting out something they were told to keep under wraps. I did a few specialized missions out in the remote parts of Pendleton, and I'll be honest, there were nights out there that gave me the creeps. I never actually saw anything that screamed, "There's a dogman out there," but we encountered weird tracks, found torn up wildlife that didn't quite match the usual predator kills. The wildest part was hearing an odd, almost guttural sound echo off those hills. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't a bobcat. I'd spent enough time in various environments, from the thick jungles in the Philippines to the desert around 29 Palms, to know typical animal calls. This was something else entirely, but I wasn't about to write a report on a strange noise. I only started feeling comfortable talking about this stuff after I retired in the mid-2000s, especially once I was out for good and not on contract or anything like that. Even then, I've never come forward publicly unless it's an anonymous forum or a message to someone I think might take it seriously. I'm still half expecting the Marine Corps to send me some form telling me to shut up. Chalk that up to old habits, I guess. I keep thinking back to those official documents. Black and white typed text with a crisp classification border. They read so clinically. Bipedal sightings consistent with large canine subjects. No direct contact. No injuries or casualties reported. You'd expect an official document to say something like, "No further action required." But instead, it specifically said, "Further sightings or corroboration demanded immediate follow-up." That's the line that stuck with me. If they were so quick to dismiss it, they wouldn't have asked for follow-ups. But the fact that you never see or hear about this stuff outside of hush-hush circles tells me there's more to it. Funny enough, a few years after I retired, I bumped into an old friend from when I was stationed at Pendleton. He asked if I remembered hearing about the werewolf files. He used that term jokingly, but he was basically talking about the same rumor of big upright canids. He claimed he'd seen a few pages referencing some controlled operation to investigate the sightings, and when he probed, he got stonewalled by a senior officer. He was told, "Don't go chasing legends, Marine," which is exactly how they handle topics they don't want lower ranks poking around in. I'm not sure where that leaves us. I don't have hard copies or photos of the documents. Even if I did, I'd probably be hammered by people calling me a hoaxer, and the rest might land me in a legal mess if I were passing around anything that's still considered restricted. What I do have are these memories of reading official text that absolutely corroborated stories about a bipedal canine creature, understood to be prowling around the outskirts of one of America's largest Marine Corps bases. That alone is enough to keep me up some nights, replaying the words in my head. I was on my usual early morning bus route in Snohomish County, right around 5:45 a.m., heading down the stretch between the Three Lakes area and Highway 9. This is typically the quietest part of my drive, and I've come to enjoy the routine of it, despite the early hour. The winter mornings here can be pitch black dark, and the only light you usually get is either from the moon, when it's out, or the dim glow of my bus headlights, because there aren't many street lamps in that more rural patch. Every so often, I'll catch a glimpse of some nocturnal wildlife, like deer or the occasional coyote, so I'm always on the lookout to avoid any collisions. Well, this one day, I'm pretty sure it was the first week of December last year, maybe the 3rd or 4th. I see what I initially thought was a large coyote, or perhaps a dog crossing the road about 20 feet ahead of me. But as I got closer, I realized it definitely wasn't any coyote or dog. I remember slowing down the bus because the shape wasn't matching up with anything typical, and it moved in this almost slithering stride, or that's how it looked under the limited light. The instant my headlights actually caught it, I saw a reflection off what looked like greenish, scaly skin. That's when I felt every hair on the back of my neck stand up. Honestly, I've never been a believer in this kind of thing. I grew up in Western Washington, and the weirdest wildlife I've ever encountered was a black bear rummaging near a dumpster. Nothing remotely bizarre, but the figure crossing the road that morning seemed vaguely humanoid, just not in any normal sense. The shape of it was tall, probably around 6 feet, maybe a bit less, but with a posture that wasn't quite upright. The limbs were elongated, and the skin, at least what I could see, had a sheen to it that didn't resemble fur or anything like that. The head seemed tapered, almost like what you'd imagine an upright lizard might look like. I had to slow to nearly a crawl, and I was worried that if it was some weird creature, I didn't want it to leap at the bus or something. It crossed in front of the headlights and disappeared on the other side of the brush. The strangest part is how it sort of crouched for a moment before darting away, as if it noticed me, or maybe just the bright lights. I didn't have any kids on board yet because this was my first loop before picking students up at Glacier Peak High School. My pickup usually starts closer to 6:10 or so I was alone in the bus, which made the whole thing even more unsettling. No one else there to confirm what I was seeing. After it vanished, I felt stuck in place for a good 10 seconds. I don't normally freeze like that, but it was such a bizarre sight that I literally couldn't wrap my mind around it. I started thinking, could this be some kind of exotic pet escaped from a private owner, or a misidentified bird or something? But there's no way. The movement and body shape was entirely too large and too humanoid. I actually found myself checking the side mirrors and scanning the roadside edges the entire rest of the route, half expecting to see it again, or something else come out of the woods. At the next stop, I tried to tell another driver over the radio, but I ended up saying I thought I saw something, never specifying. I was afraid I'd be laughed right off the radio if I started ranting about a reptilian figure crossing the road. That day I got home around my usual time, somewhere between 4:30 and 5 p.m., after all the afternoon runs. My wife asked me how my day was, and I told her I saw something odd but didn't want to talk about it yet. I think I was still processing. She insisted, so I told her it was some kind of... I didn't even use the word reptilian. I just described it as a lizard-like figure. She said I probably just saw a deer at a weird angle, or maybe a trick of the light. But I'm not that easily spooked by a mere deer, and deer definitely don't have that scaly reflection, or that upright gait. Also, I've confronted deer and elk on the road more times than I can count. None of them move like what I saw. For the next couple of days, every time I pass that specific spot, it's near the intersection where Machias Road hits the main route that leads back to Highway 9. I felt this pang of dread, like I was anticipating seeing it again or not seeing it, both equally unsettling. I even considered pulling over in daylight to see if there was any kind of footprint or disturbed brush, but it's such a busy route for a bus driver in the morning that I opted not to risk being late. Plus, there wasn't a convenient spot to park. The shoulder there is narrow and often muddy, and I worried about getting stuck or just drawing attention to myself. If any of the passing folks saw me kneeling in the brush, they'd probably wonder what was wrong with me. I did talk to a fellow driver I trust, a guy who's been on the job in Snohomish County for about 30 years, and I gave him the full story in that indirect sort of way people do when they're not sure if they're going to be believed. He told me he once thought he saw something similar back in 2002 when he was bus driving for the Monroe School District, also early in the morning. He never told anyone because he just decided it was probably his eyes playing tricks. But when I told him about the scaly sheen, he just fell quiet and suggested that maybe there's more around these parts than we realize. It was a relief that he didn't laugh. He seemed to take it in stride. Even so, we both ended up changing the subject real fast afterward, probably because we didn't want to dwell on it. Now, I went online and tried to look up sightings of strange reptilian beings in Washington state, which is something I never thought I'd do in my entire life. I didn't find a lot of official sources, obviously, but I stumbled on a few mentionings in various corners of the internet that talk about reptilian creatures being spotted in remote forested areas across the Pacific Northwest. Whether there's anything to that, I can't say. I wasn't about to call the police or mention it to the school district, for obvious reasons. Nobody wants to be the bus driver who's telling wild stories and losing credibility. A buddy of mine works part-time at a local feed store on weekends, and I slipped in a vague question about odd critters in the region. He looked at me like I was losing it, and I ended up backing off rather than pushing the conversation. I figured he'd get suspicious or start rumors if I kept pressing, so I just let it go. But the night of that sighting, it burned itself into my memory so deeply that I keep replaying it. I've even had a couple of dreams about it, which is weird. I normally don't remember any dreams. The bus route is still the same though, and I haven't seen anything like that again. I sometimes wonder if it migrated, if it even is a living, breeding thing, or if it was some fluke, or maybe some experimental creature that escaped from a lab. But that's me letting my imagination run away. The weather conditions that day were standard for early December in western Washington. Kind of drizzling, overcast, low 40s. I felt the heater on the bus wasn't working too well, so I was already a bit cranky. Sometimes I think about how none of this would have happened if I'd been driving just 5 or 10 seconds earlier or later. Maybe I'd have missed it, and my life wouldn't have this weird question mark. Part of me even gets anxious about the idea that kids might see it. I don't think it seemed particularly interested in the bus, but who knows? The whole thing was so fast, and yet, at the same time, it felt like slow motion. Like I had enough time to really look at its posture, see the shape of its skull, even notice that the arms seemed longer than an average person's arms. I still drive the same route. It's been months and no second encounter. The only difference is, I consistently have that feeling of scanning the tree line, especially when the sun hasn't come up yet. If I ever see it again, I'll look for a place to pull over and try to get some sense of tracks or something concrete. But I'm not entirely sure I'd want to step outside the bus to investigate. There's a level of caution I can't shake now. Maybe it's a leftover primal fear, because my mind keeps going back to that skin reflection. There was no fur, no feathers, just sequences of what seemed like reptilian scales, shining back at me in the headlights. I might sound completely off my rocker, but to this day, I can't rationalize it away. I've seen deer, elk, coyotes, cougars, and in very rare cases, wolves around these parts. None of those can account for what I encountered. So I'm sending you this in hopes that if anyone else in Washington or anywhere else has come across something like this, they might not feel so alone in their experience.